Welcome, everyone. You are at the Conservation Impact Evaluation and Implementation Science Seminar Series. This seminar is hosted every first Tuesday of the month, and this is the second in our series for this season. So it's great to see folks back. We've got about 50 people in the Zoom room today, and we're looking forward to another fantastic presentation and discussion. So as a reminder, this is an activity of the Impact Evaluation Working Group. And the aim of this group is really to advance conservation by promoting the adoption of counterfactual approaches to understanding impact. So if you're not already engaged with this group, please do. Check us out online at the Conservation Biology website. You can also follow us on X and sign up for our email list. So we had a great discussion and presentation by Jonah Bush last month in September. It was an update on a meta-analysis that he and co-authors have done about what drives and stops deforestation, restoration, and forest degradation. And now we're pleased to be continuing the series with a presentation from Daniela Miteva. She's visiting us from Ohio State University, where she's an associate professor at the Department of Agriculture, Environment, and Development Economics. And next month, we have the pleasure of hosting Rachel Newgarten, the Executive Director for Conservation Planning at the Wildlife Conservation Society. And she'll be talking about going from a PhD to being a practitioner, practical approaches to impact evaluation. So a bit of housekeeping before we get into things. Daniela will give a presentation, and that will be followed by a moderated question and answer session. You can post your questions in the chat at any time, and please take advantage of some of the Zoom functionality, such as live transcription. And as always, the seminar is recorded. We post this on our Vimeo channel as well as on YouTube. And if you are going to post on social media, we encourage you to use our hashtag Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual and tag IDoImpact. So with that, let me formally introduce Daniela Miteva. She'll be talking about community sawmills save forests, forest regrowth and avoided deforestation due to vertical integration of wood production in Mexican community forests. Over to you, Daniela.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Sheila. Thanks to everyone for being here. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm hoping everybody can see that. All right. So this talk is with my joined with my amazing co-authors who are scattered around in different institutions around the US and beyond. It's also a partnership between academics like me and folks working for major conservation organizations. So what we're trying to do here is figure out a way to incentivize forest protection in an area that's very important for its timber production, okay? And we're going to argue that vertical integration, specifically putting a sawmill so that we increase the value from the timber, is one way to go in that particular location. All right, so why are we doing this? In the last decade or so, there has been a strong push towards decentralization and the devolution of natural resource management to local communities, okay? There is some evidence that it's actually better because communities are able to protect their forests, okay? There is some evidence of heterogeneity. And some of the reasons that have been given as why communities are effective is that they get more income from timber production, for example. They get higher profits, they have lower transaction costs, or they allowed a wider scope of forest management activities. Okay. All right, so I'll be talking about vertical integration, but what I really mean is increasing the value of forests so that communities get a higher benefit from forests. So why would we expect that to be a way to protect forests? Well, first, the evidence tells us that it's more or less successful in certain locations. So the studies I have listed here, there are about 4 studies that use cross-sectional data with varying sample sizes. And they do find that for the most part, vertical integration is protective of forests. Okay, so they have larger areas for reforestation, workforce conservation, and so forth. Okay. However, the evidence is mostly based on cross-sectional data. It means one-time observation of communities. And a lot of these studies don't account for the fact that vertical integration is not random, right? Certain communities choose to become vertically integrated. So this is what I mean by endogeneity here. Most of these studies do not account for this non-random placement of the vertical integration. There was one exception by Torres and Mangano, who use a 7-year panel dataset on 76 ejidos, and these are community forests in Mexico. And they find that high vertical integration translates into lower deforestation. Okay, so there is some precedent that supports our hypothesis that vertical integration is actually good for forests because it increases the value of the forest and discourages conversion of the forest to other land uses. Okay, so this is the hypothesis we're going to test empirically. Why is our work important? Well, we provide one of the few tests of vertical integration using data from Mexican community forests from one state, and we'll get to this in a second. We have between 12 and 20 years of data, and we're able to apply the new generation of panel data estimators. Okay? We also apply data that allow us to differentiate between temporary forest loss and permanent forest conversion. Why is this important in Mexico? There's a lot of slash and burn agriculture that results in forest cover being temporarily lost. And then once the field is cultivated for a few years, then the forest is allowed to regrow, right? This kind of agriculture has been practiced in many locations around the world, like centuries. So policymakers often argue that this kind of temporary forest loss is not really deforestation. Okay. So we have this data set that allows us to separate the temporary from the permanent forest cover loss. And we use data from one of the mega diverse regions on the planet in terms of biodiversity. Okay. It's also really important for carbon mitigation. All right, so what do? We want to test the hypothesis that vertical integration protects forests. So we use the new generation of difference and difference models, specifically synthetic difference and difference by Arkhangelski et al. So what they do is they allow us to construct the counterfactual based on how similar it is to the treatment units. Okay? And there are different weights that allow us to establish parallel trends. So this synthetic difference method allows us to combine the best features from difference and difference and synthetic controls. Okay. It's applicable to both small samples, and we've applied it to a treatment unit, to one treatment unit compared to like 21 controls, as well as large samples where we can apply it to the whole sample we have. We also use heterogeneity robust difference and difference estimators, specifically the ones proposed by Chesmartin and Dotfoy in series of their papers. And we choose covariates that correspond to the drivers of deforestation in the study area and the profitability of timber harvesting. So in other words, we have a model that justifies the choice of covariates, right? And the covariates respond to these two factors: what's driving deforestation and what's making timber profitable. So our goal is to compare apples and apples, not apples and oranges. Okay? The covariates also help us establish parallel pretrends. We do various robustness checks, like comparisons with the traditional two-way fixed effects estimators that we know are most likely biased for various reasons. We do robustness checks with different definitions of what vertical integration means. Okay? We do comparisons with different land cover data. And we also vary the panel data estimators, alternating between dynamic models, models that account for initial conditions, and different ways to get at the causal impact. So the CSDID is the estimator by Callaway and Santana 2021. And since our treatment is at the community level, we cluster the standard errors at that level. All right. So one thing to note is that vertical integration isn't random. In other words, communities are not randomly assigned to a vertical integration class, or whether or not they should have a mill, right? So we need to think about what are we doing to address this endogeneity that may be biasing our estimates. The way we do this is we use panel data estimators that remove any linear time invariant unobserved characteristics. We use covariates motivated by theory of why timber is profitable and why deforestation happens to establish parallel pretrends. So in other words, we argue that the propensity of an ejido, this our community managed forest, to become vertically integrated is a function of these time invariant characteristics, maybe one time varying precipitation. And then we estimate the effect of the estimate the effect of the timing of mill establishment, okay, which we argue is random once we control for all these characteristics. Okay, so that's how we deal with endogeneity. We don't have any instrumental variables because we could not think of any. And if somebody has suggestions, I'm happy to take notes. Okay, so this is our study area. We focus on the forests in the state of Quintana Roo in Mexico. So this area over here. These are moist tropical forests that have important species like mahogany and cedar, right? And this is what our study area looks like. The polygons, different polygons here indicate different community managed forests that are suitable for timber production, right? So excluding agricultural ejidos and ejidos that the Mexican government doesn't classify as something that has enough forest or the forest is healthy enough to support the commercial timber production. All right. So the ejidos, so these are called ejidos in this in the state. So ejidos, if you're from Mexico or you have worked on Mexico, this is not the same as a comunidades. Comunidades usually have also community managed forests, other parts of Mexico, but they usually belong to the same ethnic group. The ejidos may comprise households who came from various parts of Mexico a long time ago. All right, so the red polygons here are the ejidos with mills, and then the gray polygons are ejidos without, all of them ejidos that are suitable for producing timber. So most forests in the state of Quintana Roo are under community management. Previous studies estimate them to about 62%, and timber is a significant source of revenue. Mostly because there is a lot of forest, about 80% of the area is under forest, and also because valuable tree species like mahogany and Spanish cedar can grow there, okay, as well as other tropical species of commercial importance. And then the other thing is that there are few non-timber opportunities apart from agriculture and tourism. The other thing that may distinguish our study area is that we have clear and secure property rights. In other words, the boundaries of the ejidos have been established a long time ago. Sometimes different ejido members may illegally harvest, but these are not the norm. Permits and forest management plans are needed to harvest timber, so nobody can just go in there and harvest as much as they want without actually coordinating with a forest management plan that has to be approved by the government. Another feature that sets the study area apart is that we have few parcelizations of ejidos. In other words, the ejidos remain spatially intact for the most part. I think about 2% of the ejidos in the state became broken into smaller pieces between 1993 and 2017, sorry. Okay. The ejidos are managed by the so-called ejidatarios. So these are households who can make decisions about the forest, and there is a complex governance structure. The thing about the ejidatarios is that the number stays the same. So even if a household splits, like for example, a household has grown sons and they marry, the household is still represented by the same number of people. So in other words, we don't have more and more ejidatarios who make decisions about the forest. Non-ejido members may receive some benefits in the form of access to non-timber products or some public good in the community. All right. The forests in the Yucatan, specifically Quintana Roo, are more or less stable. There is temporary forest loss and permanent forest loss. Over time, the temporary is due to fires or hurricane damage, especially Hurricane Dean in 2007. There may be some temporary damage from logging, specifically because some trees, if they're big enough, may be picked up by satellites as deforestation or temporary forest loss. Also, the creation of landing pads for logs and logging roads may also cause temporary forest loss. We discussed the subsistence-based shifting cultivation, the so-called milpa, in this part of Mexico, and other subsistence agriculture. Temporary forest loss seems to be dominant for the study area. About 54% has been attributed to temporary drivers between 2000 and 2012. Okay. All right. Why we may expect, given that we know what we know about temporary forest loss, what one reason vertical integration may be decreasing temporary forest loss is by encouraging better harvesting of trees so that there is an additional damage done when somebody fells a tree, right? And then vertical integration may increase the value of the timber product sold. So this may affect the volume of timber harvested. All right, so that was about temporary forest loss in Quintana Roo. There's also permanent forest loss, and that's due to urbanization, especially close to the resorts like Cancun, for example. There is legal or illegal conversion to pastures and large-scale commercial agriculture. So on the previous study by Krewolf et al. Found that about 36% on the Yucatan was lost between 2000 and 2012 because of these drivers leading to permanent forest conversion. All right, so what we do to proxy for forest cover. So if you're familiar with the Hansen dataset, it's great because it gives us coverage for the whole globe, regardless of the type of forest. However, given the specifics of the Yucatan Peninsula, specifically Quintana Roo, we need to be able to distinguish between temporary and permanent forest cover loss. So this is why we use the von Kutzam et al. 30-meter pixels annual dataset. It gives us annual deforestation, where they define deforestation as a pixel, so 30 by 30 meter cell, that lost its forest cover for more than 2.5 years. Okay. They also distinguish between degradation, which is this temporary forest loss, so less than 2.5 years of forest cover loss. Okay. And this is what we believe is capturing the traditional slash and burn or milpa agriculture. They also provide data on forest regrowth. So in other words, cells that were considered deforested being allowed to regrow. And then they also give data on undisturbed forests. For this analysis, we exclude mangroves, some of which are located along the coast. Okay. So for the main manuscript, we focus on two variables, deforestation and forest regrowth, where we define deforestation as the deforested area in a given year divided by the total forest area in a given year. Okay? And we do the same thing for forest regrowth. The reason we divide by the total forest area is that we have ejidos that vary in sizes considerably. Okay? So these two are our outcomes, and these are the transformations we employ. Our sample consists of all ejidos that could produce timber and sell timber. Okay. Our treatment is determined by whether or not there's an ejido is close to mill. We also, as a robustness check, use the conifer typologies of whether or not an ejido is considered vertically integrated. One thing about the conifer typologies is they started in 2004, and we have data up to 2016, but there's very little variability in terms of the ejido classification. There are some ejidos that switch categories for apparently no reason. So we use the conifer typologies only as a robustness check and prefer to focus on the proximity to mills as a proxy for vertical integration. We assume that once an ejido has a mill, the mill remains operational throughout the study period. Why do we do that? Because we don't have data otherwise, okay? And we focus on permanent mills. So in other words, something that requires, it's not mobile. Okay? We don't have data on mobile mills. So our treatment group is ejidos that are either have mills within their boundaries or immediately adjacent to ejidos that do have mills in their boundaries. And this definition of the treatment is corroborated by personal interactions with people who work on the ground. Okay? And we use the staggered design, meaning that once something gets treated, it remains treated throughout. And the control group are the ejidos that can produce timber. We exclude ejidos that are spanned by protected areas. So there are about 81 of those. And the reason is that for those, we can't differentiate between the impact of protected areas versus something else. Okay? We also exclude ejido bacalar because it changed its boundaries. And there are some Mennonites who have very different agricultural practices and favor agricultural conversion. So this leaves us with 223 ejidos. This is the breakdown of the sample if we look at the treatment. So the data on the right indicate proximity to mills. So our treatment being defined as whether or not an ejido is close to a mill or not. And you see that there were some ejidos that were adjacent to mills at the beginning of our study period in 1996. Okay. And then the number increased throughout time. At the end of the data, we have 78 ejidos that were treated and 175 ejidos that were never close to a mill. If we look at the data as defined with vertical integration defined by the conifer typologies, we have non-forestry ejidos. These agricultural ejidos we exclude. They're not suitable for timber production because they don't have forest and they don't have permits and all that. The conifer typology distinguishes between potential producers. They tend to be really small. Those selling stumpage, so in other words, selling the rights to somebody to go harvest timber. Selling ejido selling roundwood, in other words, cut down trees. And then vertically integrated ejidos. As I mentioned, there is very little variability, and most of these numbers are driven by like 5 ejidos that flip-flop across years. All right, there is some evidence. So we have data on patchy management, forest management plans. Why the patchy? Because it's a sample of 80 forest management plans in 2013. It's not random, but it still gives us some evidence that supports our hypothesis that vertical integration is actually good for forests. So here I've used the conifer typology, type 2 meaning the ejido selling stumpage, type 4 meaning the one that sell vertical produce timber processed products like furniture, okay? And type 3 are the ones selling roundwood. What you can see here is that the ejidos that the most vertically integrated have the largest area under forest management, okay? They also are authorized to cut the most. They have, most of them employ some kind of forest management practice. So vine cutting, they have prescribed burning, they have forest restoration, pruning, and so forth. thinning treatments, direction of filling, and fire prevention. So in other words, these data consistent with our claim that vertical integration protects forests, okay? But again, these are not causal. These are just correlations based on 80 forest management plans. Okay. All right. And then if we look at the summary statistics, we also find some evidence that our hypothesis is supported. So here the treatment is whether or not an ejido it was ever adjacent to a sawmill compared to an ejido that was never close to a sawmill. And as you can see, ejidos that were close to sawmills lost less forest. Actually, they gained about 0.5% forest relative to ejidos that were never close to a sawmill. And this is on average. Okay? And they experienced less forest loss overall and more forest regrowth. So again, these numbers, summary statistics, nothing causal yet, suggest that vertical integration may be a viable way to protect forests. Okay, so once we do the estimation, so what you're seeing here is the are the results from an event study using the estimator by Martin and Foy. The way to read this is we have the forest loss divided by the total forest area in a given year, okay? And then we have the relative time to treatment. So with treatment happening at time 0, okay? And then these are not the negative numbers indicate pre-trends. For a analysis to be valid, we want the pre-trends to be insignificant. This is supported by the confidence intervals being so wide that they span the 0 line. That's what the blue line here is. Okay? And past 0, these are the periods after the treatment changes. What we see here is that there are parallel pre-trends, so no statistically significant differences in the pre-trends, but then once we put a sawmill, forest cover loss begins to decline, and this is permanent conversion of forest to something else. Okay. So in other words, this graph here indicates that once the sawmills relate to less deforestation. Similarly, if we look at forest regrowth, we have new forest divided by the total forest area in each year on the vertical axis. And then the blue line here is the 0 line. So if a confidence interval, so this red bar, if it crosses the 0 line, then the estimate is statistically insignificant. So what we see here is that for the most part, the parallel trends are supported. So, and once we establish a sawmill, then we see an increase in forest regrowth. Again, this is consistent with our hypothesis. And we wanted to see why that's the case. So we looked at the changes in population density. So, and the way I've defined it is the number of people per square kilometer. Fairly some really huge confidence intervals here. But one thing to note is that post the establishment of sawmills, we see fewer people moving in the more vertically integrated ejidos. Right? So in other words, our interpretation of these results is that deforestation, the decrease in deforestation and the increase in reforestation also are correlated with low population pressure. Right? We can't say more about the mechanisms without doing a survey, but this is something that I find really interesting personally. Oh, shoot. Okay. And the results are very robust. So we did a comparison with conifer using the synthetic diff and diffs. When we consider the conifer typologies and a sample size of 1, we find results that are very suggestive and repeat patterns, but are not statistically significant. And one of the explanations is that the sample size may be too small. When we repeated this synthetic diff and diff on the whole sample, the results were very much consistent with the results I just showed you. Okay, so in other words, we have reason to believe that our estimates are robust and are not dependent on the choice of estimator. Okay. So in other words, encouraging results, but they come with 2 big caveats. First of all, we use data from 1 state in Mexico. Okay? Quintana Roo may be special for its own reasons. We discussed earlier. So the secured property rights, the long traditions in timber harvesting, the suitability for growing mahogany and cedar, which are really high value species. Okay, so we have one state in Mexico. We have data on mills, and we assume that once a mill is established, it stays operational, at least during our study period. This seems to be more or less a reasonable assumption given a short time horizon, but we don't have any data on mobile mills, and we also don't know if a mill was operated in a given year, right? So in other words, it may still be functional, but the community may decide not to run it in a given year. We don't know that. We also have limited time periods. So if you remember, our conifer topologies ranked between 2004 and 2016, whereas the mill data are from 1996 up to 2008. We don't have anything that's more recent. So two big questions come up. How generalizable the results are, especially given that it's a reduced form study based on counterfactual, and also the scalability. So we're proposing that mills may be really important, but we did our study in one state in Mexico. So the issue of scalability is a big one that needs to be addressed by future work. And the big thing that comes up is, why is vertical integration helping? So we propose two mechanisms, specifically keeping people out and increasing the value of the forest so that communities want to have the forest as opposed to an agricultural field. All right, so given these caveats, the main messages from our work are that mills helped, at least in the state of Quintana Roo. They reduced deforestation and increased forest regrowth during our study area, and the results are very robust across specification. These results are important because, as I mentioned, Yucatan is a biodiversity hotspot, high threat, high number species. Also is important for climate change mitigation through avoiding deforestation and reforestation. And previous work by one of my co-authors and colleagues has estimated about 3 gigatons of CO2 per year. So in other words, low-cost carbon change mitigation. But this work also raises these important questions, which are, what are the channels through which vertical integration protects forests? Okay, how do we incentivize communities to become and remain vertically integrated? And then what do we do in a case of institutional vacuum? So the Yucatan has a lot of NGOs, and they may be instrumental in helping the vertical integration work. So these are the questions I'm going to leave you with. And if you have any comments or feedback and we don't get to it today, please email me. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Now, my colleague Elias Cisneros will be handling the Q&A. So if you haven't already, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat.
Okay, yes, hello, Daniela. Very nice talk. Thank you very much. And yes, I go right ahead, maybe to a few questions on data. So why did you now exclude the degradation data and just focused on deforestation and regrowth?
So the reason is that traditional agriculture has been practiced forever, right? So in other words, slash and burn farming is part of the identity of the communities who live in the state of Quintana Roo. So that's one reason why we excluded temporary forest loss. But we do have data, and I believe a table in the appendix that talks about whether or not it's logging versus something else. So I could bring it back into the main manuscript, but that was the main reason. So I wanted to make sure that we're not conflating changes in the forest management practices with changes in subsistence agriculture.
All right. Now a new question on data. Could you please explain more on the definition of the adjacent agency to sawmills? Does it mean that there are sawmills in the ejidos? Do you consider the sawmills in the neighborhood ejidos? So how do you define it? Yes, again.
So these are the ejidos, the red ejidos are the ones with mills, regardless of when the mill was established. And then we defined adjacent ejidos as anything that's touching the boundaries of these red ejidos.
Okay.
So immediate adjacency it's not based on roads or any travel distance, but whether or not they're touching the boundaries. And the reason we did this is that we heard So we heard that communities may use each other's mills.
So more to the interpretation of your results. So in your study design, are you seeking to quantify the expected impact of vertical integration for a randomly chosen community? Or if so, would you agree that your study does not tell us whether we can expect similar impacts from the intervention by outside agents to encourage vertical integration? Yeah.
So what we're saying is that, so let's get to the statistics first. So we get the average impact on forest loss from being close to a sawmill. Okay, so I can, using dynamic estimators, you can also account for was the average for every single year you have a mill next to you. Okay, I didn't have the results here. Okay, in terms of the generalizability of the results, our results are suggestive that mills can work, but this is what we call a reduced form study. So in other words, it's one study area for a given time period. We're suggesting mills can work, but I cannot answer the question whether they'll necessarily work in other parts of Mexico, like Campeche, which is right next to Quintana Roo, but has a lot of violence and drug trafficking and all that. Does this answer the question?
Yes, it was a little bit on the generalizability or the external validity. If I keep up with that, so another question was, what is happening with population density decline? Are people leaving in ejidos close to mills, leaving because of poverty or reduced access to forest products?
I need to check the data, but my impression is that they're increasing at a slower rate. So in other words, we still see newcomers, not people leaving, but fewer newcomers than in ejidos that are not vertically integrated. And one thing that could be going on is that those ejidos may be combining revenue from like other sources. Like if they're close to Cancun, they may be hiring more workers to help with the tourist sector. So we do, in the analysis, we do account for whether or not an ejido is close to an archaeological site. So this is Maya area, and there are some important sites along this. So we do control for that. But yeah, so the short story is I don't know exactly why the population is changing. My guess is because of workers. And just fewer workers are coming to these vertically integrated ejidos than in other ejidos.
Okay, another challenge on your attribution here, a longer paragraph. So I doubt interference or spillovers among the ejidos drives your results. But I'm wondering if you attempted to assess its potential influence on your estimated impacts. By inference, I mean that how an ejido uses its forests in a year depends on the vertical integration status of the rest of the ejidos in Quintana Roo. Though, for example, effects on timber prices or interference may be an issue in scaling up vertical integration. So again, is it more about the ejidos or the spatial relationship between those?
So I don't know. So the information about prices I have comes from a secondary study by Eddie Ellis, and it seems that the prices in the Yucatan course relate with global prices. So I don't know about spillovers in the sense that, sorry, I have a kid here. So I don't know if it's any spillover effect. So, and the reason I say I don't know is that the timber markets may be a little bit weird in Quintana Roo. So I've heard stories where there is a monopoly buyer. So in other words, one buyer who can exert pressure on individual producers. Okay. So in other words, the question about spillovers is a really important one, but we don't have any data to assume that, to test any spillover effects.
Another one, how robust are these new estimators to the exclusion of time-varying confounders of treatment and outcomes like new roads emerging over time? Is it possible to calculate Rosenbaum bounds or similar for the staggered DID?
Yeah, it should be easy to assess some robustness check. I don't know about the Roosevelt bonds, but there's also the paper by Cinelli and Hazmat. So we haven't done a robustness check yet, but what we have done is robustness relative to initial conditions. So in other words, did the community have a mill or not? So yeah, we haven't done any kind of unobserved confounders, but the question is, how do we know there's a confounder? And we use theory to motivate the choice of covariates. In other words, we use theory to get us the covariates we need, and whether or not there's an additional confounder. Based on theory, we can't think of one, but we can do the robustness check.
So, if you compare it to mills in Indonesia, right, where they clearly drive deforestation, right? So a new mill will lead to more deforestation in the sense, right? Why is it here now that it's not? It's just that market integration is there and value of forests increases, or why is it? Why do you think?
So I'm talking about mills in Indonesia. So Indonesia is very different. Indonesia has mills for oil palm, and that they're causing a lot of damage, right? Being close to an oil palm mill is significant driver of deforestation. In the Yucatan, I think there is little oil palm as of yet, and there's a little bit of sugarcane, okay, but it's not as bad as it is in Indonesia. In Indonesia, my work is showing that logging companies also have to negotiate with communities, and depending on depending on if the community can get together and come up with some kind of like communal agreement, they can fight the logging companies off. So in other words, it's not the same. It's the same, but also not the same, right? So in other words, if we have strong communities, as the case in the Yucatan, then communities can fight off these external pressures, and that's the similarity. But in Indonesia, the drivers are very different. Like oil palm is a big deal, and also the institutional support, in unclear property rights, and so forth. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it goes into the direction, right? I mean, I would say, okay, it reduces the costs of production, right? And then therefore maybe it increases the pressure on deforestation in both cases, right? But you're saying that here the value of forests is increasing so much that it counteracts the effect of reduced costs, right?
Well, it's just not just the value of the forest, but also how you harvest the forest. Because if you sell the rights to somebody else to harvest this forest, then they don't care how they harvest. So in other words, they don't use directional felling. They just cut down trees as much as they can without any concern about the damage to surrounding trees. We're seeing that a lot in Quintana Roo, right? So no directional felling unless you're vertically integrated. Vertically integrated communities also protect the way they harvest because they do it in-house, okay? And then they make timber, or they harvest the timber, they make furniture and sell the furniture at much higher prices. So it's a combination of two effects.
Yes, I would ask now people to just raise their hand if they want to add another question. And Rachel, maybe you can unmute them. Oh, there's another one. As the earlier questions indicated, these results might encourage NGOs to support vertical integration as a way to reduce deforestation. How confident do you feel that these results support such programs? So if so, what factors should practitioners consider in the design? What risks to consider?
So the first thing is, why is deforestation happening? What is caused the comparison between Indonesia and the Yucatan, right? So the first thing is understanding how vertical integration is impacting the factors driving deforestation. In the Yucatan, we have a clearer story, right? Vertical integration increases the value of the forest. We have markets for timber and the timber products, okay? And then it also creates incentives for communities to adopt better forest management practices and regrow their forests. So the short story is we need an explanation of the mechanisms, and then at least a conceptual, I'm not asking for like a formal mechanism, but some kind of a conceptual representation of how vertical integration is likely to change. So in our study area, it seems that vertical integration is indeed something that's really good for forests. And it could be helpful for NGOs to come work with communities and help them become vertically integrated and stay vertically integrated. In other parts of the world, like Indonesia, FSC seems to be effective, and then NGOs are really instrumental in getting communities up to speed to implement FSC practices. So the short story is these results are useful for the Yucatan. They also pose important questions about the mechanisms of forest cover loss. Okay, what kind of forest loss is gone, and also how do we break this chain? So other parts of the world, if it's insecure property rights, then maybe NGOs should focus on fixing those first, or at least working with governments to fix the property rights.
So another question then asks, right, do you have data on this question of improved practices like directional felling to support that mechanism for your impacts?
Yeah, based on 80 forest management plans. So this table here is the data from 80 forest management plans in 2013. So I don't know if you can see the top of my screen, but this is the most vertically integrated type of ejidos, type 4, according to CONO4. And that correlates really well with whether or not the ejido has a mill. And then type 2 is the least vertical integration. In other words, they sell stumpage. So if you see here, there is fire prevention. Everybody does fire prevention in the vertically integrated ejidos. Like 3/4 only do fire prevention in the less vertically integrated ejidos. Okay, directional felling. Everybody in the vertically integrated ejidos, about 2/3 in the least vertically integrated ejidos. So this evidence is suggestive that what we're claiming is actually what's happening on the ground.
I would also have a question again on the measurement. So because you used the new satellite data, right? You can now distinguish better between degradation, which you associate with agricultural practices, right?
Degradation, yeah, but temporary agricultural practices, right?
Temporary. Okay. And so do you have results looking at this outcome? Right? It
I
shouldn't
believe,
matter, right?
yeah, I believe it was statistically insignificant, but I don't have them here.
Okay. Yes.
And also we do have the data from Krylov et al. So Krylov et al. Did a study on the Yucatan and attributed forest cover loss within 2020 to 2000 to 2012 to different drivers. So they actually know if a forest became sugarcane, whether it became oil palm or something else. So we also have these results where I use the Krylov zones as a zone and do zonal statistics to see how much of the forest loss actually became sugarcane. And the results are very consistent, but I don't have them here.
Okay. Is there any further question from the audience? Yeah, there is. Do community sawmills mean community level self-governance of natural resources?
So the way the ejidos work is there is a group of ejido members who are responsible for making decisions about how the natural resource is managed. Not everybody who lives in an ejido have a say. So there are people who may live within the boundaries of the ejido, but not be allowed to say anything about how the forest is managed. Okay? So this is what I mean by community management. So there is a representative sample of households who are responsible, but also households who are not allowed to make decisions about the forest. Okay. Yeah, but they may get some benefits in terms of like better infrastructure within the ejido or so forth. Even if they're not directly involved in the timber management and they're not directly getting revenue, they may still get benefits from the forest.
Okay. In your summary, Sheila asks, you mentioned the climate mitigation potential of cost-effective natural climate solutions.
Mhm.
can you say more about the effect size of the community sawmill and whether this might be a cost-effective solution? What future research is needed here?
Future world researchers would need it. So this number, the 3 gigatons of CO2 per year, comes from a paper by Bronson Griscom. So the way we've been quantifying cost effective is to look at some kind establish how costly it is to avoid flipping a pixel to a land use that's not forest. Okay. And I believe he uses some data from the study area to come up with this number. Okay. But I don't think he uses I don't think it's based on like a land use. We do like for Colombia, we do like a land use mixed panel data mixed logit, and we simulate what happens if we introduce payments for carbon. I don't think they do this kind of analysis for the Yucatan. So cost effective means like based on previous estimates, what do we think the costs are relative to what the benefits of carbon emissions mitigation is, right? I think they use the social cost of carbon of like $100. I need to double check.
But can you go back to your effect sizes and tell us a little bit back on the envelope calculation, how much that means here?
So these are event study estimates, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the event study estimate, this gives us for like every year what's the effect of having a mill close to you. Where these do not give us the impact of the number of years you remain close to a mill. So that's one thing that I need to add to the paper as the dynamic estimator by Chaise Martin and Foy gives us actually that estimate. It's not here. So these are just annual impacts, event study, whether or not you're close to a mill.
Yes. So another question again to the data, right? Is there a way to distinguish temporary and permanent loss if the end of the temporary loss period is outside of your study period?
The end. Okay, so so in other words, you're saying that I think so. If you understand correctly, the question is asking if the data end in 2008, and the Van Cutsem data tells us like in 2008 a pixel was considered like degraded or temporarily lost. Is this affected by the choice of the year? Is this what this question is asking?
It's more about measurement than about identification. So
No, yeah, that's what I was.
yeah.
The Van Cutsem data goes from like 1992 or 1989 up to 2021. So in other words, they know for every single year what happened to a forest cell, and then they can revisit a few years later, like 2.5 years later, to figure out whether or not the forest cell became reforested again. And if it did, it would be labeled like temporary forest loss versus permanent forest conversion. So I don't think the choice of the years matters for the Van Cutsem data. So I don't think that's biasing our results.
Another question, do better practices listed in the forest management plans translate to less deforestation as measured in the satellite data?
That's a very good question. So I can't answer it because this is not a random sample. So this is 80 ejidos out of 224. But what I did at some point was to do a non-metric multidimensional scaling and see if ejidos that have better practices correlate with better vertical integration and less deforestation. And the answer is yes. But this is again this is based on suggestive evidence, non-metric multidimensional scaling, which is not causal in any way.
Yes. So yeah, different treatments would solve the problem here, right? But
yeah, we did do so. There was very little variability in these categories. So what we ended up doing was pool them, right? We don't use individual ejido fixed effects, just eared fixed effects, and test if your vertical integrated is better for forests. And we do find that that's the case too. So 22, so being the most vertically integrated and having a sawmill, according to Conifer, reduces deforestation by about 22% relative to a hedos that sells stumpage. But we didn't find any statistically significant impact on reforestation.
Let's have a final clarification question, which I'm still also trying to figure out due to the attribution thing, right? So somebody asked, please, I missed your response to the data source of vertical integration. How was it calculated? So this vertical integration, right? So you basically measure it through the establishment or being close to a mill, right? So what is it actually that you're measuring here, and how is it that you're measuring it?
So there are two things. The main analysis uses proximity to a sawmill, right? And the reason is that we have a staggered adoption. So in other words, hedos that progressively become closer to mills, and nobody, by assumption, loses the proximity to mills. Okay. So being close to mill correlates with the conifer typology of how vertically integrated an ejido is. But one thing, so in other words, everybody who is listed as vertically integrated here has a mill or is adjacent to a mill. So there's a perfect correlation. Some mills that are listed as selling roundwood, based on just like talking to people in the area, mentioned that they actually use their neighbors' mills. So some of these who are selling roundwood may be adjacent to mills and using the neighbor's mill. So we did analysis using these two definitions of the treatment, but we are claiming this is our main analysis, the stuff in blue. So being whether or not you're close to a mill. Does make sense?
There's another question. So there's a question between the difference between ejidos and comunidades, right? Are similar sawmills practices also found there? Would we expect similar different results?
Well, so one hypothesis why we think vertical integration works here is that we have secure property rights and very little violence. So Campeche, which is the neighboring state, has a lot of like money laundering from coca and other drugs, like Campeche is down here. I know that David Bray has data on vertical integration from conifer from Oaxaca, but the only time they have a lot of comunidades there, right? I think very few ejidos, mostly comunidades, but it's only cross-sectional. So I've looked at it, but I haven't used it. So the question I'll have is the study areas in Oaxaca similar to the one in Yucatan? So in other words, are the forests also commercially viable? Are the property rights secure? Do we have established timber markets, however imperfect they are? So these are the three questions I'll ask before thinking about community mills.
Thank you, Daniela. We're at the top of the hour, and thank you everyone for your questions. Really promising results there. And to everyone, please join us next month for Rachel Newgarden, Executive Director of Conservation Planning at Wildlife Conservation Society. Look forward to seeing you on November 5th.